Nimue said nothing. Her madness had fled the moment my hand touched hers, but it had left her horribly weak. I helped her on the steeper portions of the path. We passed through the hermit's caves without being troubled. Perhaps they were all asleep, or else the gods had put the isle under a spell as we two walked our way north, away from the dead souls. The sun rose. I could see now that Nimue's hair was matted with dirt and crawling with lice. Her skin was filthy, and she had lost her golden eye. She was so weak she could hardly walk, and as we descended the hill towards the causeway, I picked her up in my arms and found she weighed less than a 10-year-old child. "You're weak," I said.
"I was born weak, Derval," she said, "and life is spent pretending otherwise."
"You need some rest," I said.
"I know."
She leaned her head against my chest, and for once in her life she was utterly content to be looked after. I carried her to the causeway and over the first wall. The sea broke on our left, and the bay glimmered a reflection of the rising sun on our right. I did not know how I was to take her past the guards. All I knew was that we had to leave the isle because that was her fate, and I was the instrument of that fate. And so I walked content that the gods would solve the problem when I reached the final barrier. I carried her over the middle wall, with its row of skulls, and walked towards Dumnonia's dawn-green hills. I could see a single spearman silhouetted above the final wall's sheer, smooth face of stone, and I supposed some of the guards had rowed across the channel when they saw me leaving the isle. More guards were standing on the shingle bank. They had stationed themselves to bar my passage to the mainland. If I have to kill, I thought, then kill I shall. This was the gods' will, not mine, and Howlbane would cut with a god's skill and strength. But as I walked towards the final wall, with my burden light in my arms, the gates of life and death swung open to receive me. I half expected the guard commander to be there with his rusty spear, ready to turn me back. Instead, it was Galahad and Cavan who waited on the black threshold with their swords drawn and battle shields on their arms. "We followed you," Galahad said. "Badwen sent us," Cavan said. I covered Nimue's awful hair with the cloak's hood, so my friends would not see her degradation, and she clung to me, trying to hide herself. Galahad and Cavan had brought my men, who had commandeered the ferry and were holding the isle's guardians at spear point on the channel's farther bank. "We would have come looking for you today," Galahad said, then made the sign of the cross as he stared down the causeway. He gave me a curious look, as though he feared I might have come back from the isle a different man. "I should have known you would be here," I told him. "Yes," he said. "You should." There were tears in his eyes, tears of happiness. We rowed across the channel, and I carried Nimue up the road of skulls to the feast hall at the road's end, where I found a man loading a cart with salt to carry to Dernovaria. I laid Nimue on his cargo and walked behind her as the cart creaked north towards the town. I had brought Nimue out of the Isle of the Dead, back to a land at war. I took Nimue to Khiled's farm. I did not put her in the big hall, but rather used an abandoned shepherd's cottage, where the two of us could be alone. I fed her on broth and milk, but first I washed her clean, washed every inch of her, washed her twice, and then washed her black hair, and afterwards used a bone comb to tease the tangles free. Some of the tangles were so tight they needed to be cut, but most came free, and when her hair hung wet and straight, I used the comb to find and kill the lice before I washed her once again. She endured the process like a small, obedient child, and when she was clean, I wrapped her in a great woolen blanket and took the broth off the fire and made her eat, while I washed myself and hunted down the lice that had gone from her body onto mine. By the time I had finished, it was dusk, and she was fast asleep on a bed made from newly cut bracken. She slept all night, and in the morning ate 6 eggs I had stirred in a pan over the fire. Then she slept again, while I took a knife and a piece of leather and cut an eye patch with a lace she could tie around her hair. I had one of Khiled's slaves bring clothes and sent Issa into town to find what news he could. He was a clever lad with an easy, open manner, so that even strangers were happy to confide in him across a tavern's table.
"Well, half the town says the war's already lost, Lord,"
he told me on his return. Nimue was sleeping, and we spoke beside the stream which ran close beside the cottage. "And the other half?" I asked. He grinned.
"Looking forward to Lunasa, Lord. They're not thinking beyond that, but the half that are thinking are all Christians."
He spat into the stream.
"They say Lunasa's an evil feast, and that King Gorfethid is coming to punish our sins."
"In which case," I said, "we'd better make sure we commit enough sins to deserve the punishment." He laughed.
"Some say Lord Arthur daren't leave town for fear there'd be a revolt once his soldiers are gone."
I shook my head. "He wants to be with Guinevere at Lunasa."
"Who wouldn't?"
Issa asked. "Did you see the goldsmith?" I asked. He nodded.
"Well, he says he can't make an eye in under 2 weeks because he's never done one before, but he'll find a corpse and cut out its eye to get the size right. I told him he'd better make it a child's corpse, for the lady isn't big, is she?"
He jerked his head towards the cottage. "You told him the eye had to be hollow."
"I did, Lord."
"You did well," I told him. "And now I suppose you want to do your worst and celebrate Lunasa." He grinned.
"Yes, Lord."
Lunasa was supposedly a celebration of the imminent harvest, yet the young have always made it a feast of fertility, and their festivities would begin this night, the feast's eve. "Then go," I told him. "I'll stay here." That afternoon I made Nimue her own bower for Lunasa. I doubted somehow that she would appreciate it, but I wanted to do it, and so I made a small lodge beside the stream, cutting the withies and bending them into a hooded shelter, into which I wove cornflowers, poppies, ox-eyes, foxgloves, and long tangling swathes of pink convolvulus. Such booths were being made all across Britain for the feast, and all across Britain, late next spring, hundreds of Lunasa babies would be born. The spring was reckoned a good time to be born, for the child would come into a world waking to summer's plenty, though whether this year's planting would lead to a lucky crop depended on the battles that must be fought after harvest. Nimue emerged from the hut just as I was weaving the last foxgloves into the bower's summit.
"Is it Lunasa?"
she asked in surprise. "Tomorrow." She laughed shyly.
"No one ever made me a bower."
"You never wanted one."
"I do now," she said,
and sat under the flowery shade with such a look of delight that my heart leapt. She had found the eye patch, and donned one of the dresses Khiled's maid had brought to the hut. It was a slave's dress of ordinary brown cloth, yet it suited her as simple things always did. She was pale and thin, but she was clean, and there was a blush of colour in her cheeks.
"I don't know what happened to the golden eye,"
she said ruefully, touching her new patch. "I'm having another eye made," I told her, but did not add that the goldsmith's deposit had taken the last of my coins. I desperately needed a battle's plunder, I thought, to replenish my purse.
"And I'm hungry,"
Nimue said, with a touch of her old mischievousness. I put some birch twigs in the bottom of the pan so the broth would not stick, then poured in the last of the broth and set it on the fire. She ate it all, and afterward she stretched out in the Lunasa bower and watched the stream. Bubbles showed where an otter swam under water. I'd seen him earlier, an old dog with a hide scarred by battle and near misses from hunters' spears. Nimue watched his bubble trail disappear beneath a fallen willow, and then began to talk. She always had an appetite for talk, but that evening it was insatiable. She wanted news, and I gave it to her. But then she wanted more detail, always more detail, and every detail she obsessively fitted inside a scheme of her own devising, so that the story of the last year became, at least for her, like a great tiled floor, where any one tile might seem insignificant, but added to the others it became a part of an intricate and meaningful whole. She was most interested in Merlin and the scroll he had snatched from Ban's doomed library.
"You didn't read it?" she asked.
"No."
"I will,"
she said fervently. I hesitated a moment, then spoke my mind. "I thought Merlin would come to the Isle to fetch you," I said. I was risking offending her twice, first by implicitly criticizing Merlin, and secondly by mentioning the one subject she did not talk about, the Isle of the Dead. But she did not seem to mind.
"Merlin would reckon I can look after myself," she said,
then smiled.
"And he knows I have you."
It was dark by then, and the stream rippled silver under Lunas's moon. There were a dozen questions I wanted to ask, but dared not. But suddenly she began to answer them anyway. She spoke of the Isle, or rather she spoke of how one tiny part of her soul had always been aware of the Isle's horror, even as the rest of her had abandoned itself to its doom.
"I thought madness would be like death," she said, "and that I wouldn't know there was an alternative to being mad. But you do know. You really do. It's as though you watch yourself and cannot help yourself. You forsake yourself," she said,
then stopped, and I saw the tears at her one good eye. "Don't," I said, suddenly not wanting to know.
"And sometimes," she went on, "I would sit on my rock and watch the sea, and I would know I was sane, and I would wonder what purpose was being served. And then I knew. I would have to be mad, because if I was not, then it was all to no purpose."
"There was no purpose," I said angrily.
"Oh, Derval, dear Derval, you have a mind like a stone falling off a cliff."
She smiled.
"It's the same purpose that made Merlin find Calethan's skull. Don't you understand? The gods play games with us, but if we open ourselves, then we can become a part of the game instead of its victims. Madness has a purpose. It's a gift from the gods, and like all their gifts, it comes with a price, but I've paid it now."
She spoke passionately, but suddenly I felt a yawn threatening me, and try as I might, I could not check it. I did try to hide it, but she saw anyway.
"You need some sleep," she said.
"No," I protested.
"Did you sleep last night?"
"A little." I had sat at the cottage door and dozed fitfully as I listened to the mice scrabbling in the thatch.
"Then go to bed now," she said firmly, "and leave me here to think."
I was so tired I could scarcely undress, but at last I lay on the bracken bed where I slept like the dead. It was a great deep sleep, like the rest that comes in safety after battle, when the bad sleep, the one interrupted by nightmare reminders of near spear thrusts and sword blows, has been washed away from the soul. Thus I slept, and in the night Nimue came to me, and at first I thought it was a dream, but then I woke with a start to find her chill, naked skin next to mine.
"It's all right, Derval," she whispered. "Go to sleep."
And I slept again, with my arms around her thin body. We woke in Lunas's perfect dawn. There have been times in my life of pure happiness, and that was one. There are times, I suppose, when love is in step with life, or perhaps when the gods want us to be fools, and nothing is so sweet as Lunas's foolishness. The sun shone, filtering its light through the flowers in our bower, where we made love. Then afterwards we played like children in the stream, where I tried to make otter bubbles under water, and came up choking to find Nimue laughing.